Welcome to our lecture on Benjamin Franklin, one of the most colorful personalities in our whole cycle and one of the great founders of the American Republic. He was born in 1706 and lived a very long life, dying in 1790. He was born in Boston, not far from here, in Milk Street, opposite Old South Church. In fact, he was baptized in Old South Church. That building stands. He was born into a city that was still full of the spirit of Puritanism. Cotton Mather was one of the great figures of that time that still exercised influence. And he wrote a book called Essays to Do Good, which had a great influence on Benjamin Franklin and on the work that we've excerpted for the great conversation from his autobiography, as we call it now. It would have been his memoirs at the time. The genre of autobiography was later named. He was the youngest son of a tallow chandler and soap boiler. So this is not the upper middle class. Obviously, this is lower middle class. And Josiah, his father, was an immigrant from England to the United States. He had left under the Restoration monarch Charles II because he was a Puritan. Josiah was a Puritan, and he wanted to exercise his beliefs freely. So he came to America. And so he's a serious Christian. He marries into a serious Puritan family. And so that's the milieu that Benjamin grows up in. And in fact, he's the youngest son of a youngest son, and that goes back a few generations. Ben Franklin found this to be noteworthy. He only had 2 years of formal schooling. So the man that we often call Dr. Franklin only had a very little formal education. The first year of that was at what would become the Boston Latin School. But they weren't able to continue with that. So he was apprenticed to his older brother, James, in the printing business. What Benjamin, and this reminds us of Abraham Lincoln, what he loved to do was read. And his older brother didn't appreciate that. So again, a lot of parallels, not as much formal schooling, but a lot of love of reading between Franklin and Lincoln. So he would read authors like Bunyan and Defoe and Locke, Xenophon, Shaftesbury. I mean, he just was voracious. And very importantly, he read the essays of the Spectator, Addison and Steele, and that he learned a lot of the style from that. These are very typical of the early Enlightenment. His brother would go on to form one of the first papers of the colonies, the New England Current, and Ben, while he was a teenager, would write these essays anonymously because he didn't think his brother would publish them otherwise. Submitted them surreptitiously to his brother under the pseudonym Silence Dogood. So those are some of the first writings we've got. Very witty. Obviously, a great intelligence is emerging here. The big shift in his life, though, comes at the age of 17 when he leaves Boston, flees basically to eventually to Philadelphia. He stops off briefly in New York, but can't find work. He's indentured to his brother, so he's a fugitive according to the law. He ends up getting work in the printing business of Samuel Keimer. And Philadelphia is a newer city than Boston. It is up and coming. It will become, in fact, because of its position in the trade networks, the second city of the British Empire. It is next to London. It is, it's a very impressive kind of urban source of new energy. And it's laid out, as you know, very different from Boston. Boston, you walk around, the streets are crooked and narrow. Philadelphia has that grid system. Franklin really appreciated the kind of rationality of the layout. He, pretty soon after getting to Philadelphia, though, he's convinced by the governor of Pennsylvania, who's this odd personality. He says, I will set you up with your own printing business. I'll give you letters of credit. He goes off to London with those letters, which are worth nothing. And so he's stuck. He's stuck in London. He finds work at a printer there. He gets lodging next to a bookseller. Sounds like a pretty nice setup, and he gets books from there to read. He ends up finding someone who will help get him back to the colonies in 1726. And then he sets up this mutual aid society, the Junto. We would pronounce it Junto, but it is a grouping of tradesmen, artisans who get together every Friday evening to ask the questions of morals, politics, and natural philosophy, kind of like the Great Conversation, and also is there for business networking. It's a lovely kind of Enlightenment thing where here's Franklin who's always extroverted, who really wants to be in company, and he finds these like-minded men who want to pursue these questions. That will eventually become well, there are two things that come out of the Junto. That is, eventually they want books to be able to read and discuss. Books are not all the cheapest of things, so Franklin comes up with the idea of a subscription library out of this. So that's the first subscription library in Philadelphia. That's the Library Company in Philadelphia. And later, from the Junto will come the American Philosophical Society. So that's fascinating, this little thing when he's just 21 years old. In 1729, he buys the Pennsylvania Gazette from Keimer, with whom he had started to become competitive. His illegitimate son William is born. We don't know the mother. William is very important in Franklin's life. The first part of the autobiography is addressed to your son, and it's William that he's talking about. Billy is the one who holds the kite, actually, for the famous experiment. He's with him all over, but there's this falling out. And it's worth noting that even though the autobiography begins with an address to William, William was always a loyalist, and they broke over that. It's a very sad thing. In 1730, Franklin enters into a common law union with Deborah Reed. It has to be that. It can't be marriage because they had been engaged, Ben and Deborah, before he was led into this London misadventure. He breaks that engagement. She goes off and marries another man who then himself runs away. They don't know. Nobody knows whether he's still alive. So there's that. And Franklin himself might have contracted a marital union in England too. So they stay together. There's a common law union with Deborah. In 1731, he becomes a Freemason and stays a Freemason for the rest of his life. This is important because Freemasonry is part of the story of the Enlightenment. You think about probably the supreme artistic expression of the Enlightenment would be the Magic Flute by Mozart, and it's Freemasonry, just in the most beautiful music. It's part of the background here. Now, there's a lot of mystery, obviously, almost perforce about Freemasonry, and there's a lot of religious polemic against it. But it's something to understand. It is certainly it's a fraternal organization, certainly in their thoughts meant for the common good. All right. We keep on. I've only got dates really to where the autobiography ends, which is before the great political involvement that we tend to think of when we think of Franklin. The other side of so he's one of the great founders because of those activities that we'll mention at the end, but he's also, of course, the supreme representative of the American Enlightenment, right? As a founder, he's right behind George Washington, but as the embodiment of America, frankly, for Europe, in the mind of Europe, Ben Franklin was the man. And any account of the American Enlightenment must say that Ben Franklin embodies and typifies the thing. He is the one who names and charts the Gulf Stream for the first time. He notices on his transatlantic journeys that there's the difference between the time it takes to go east as opposed to west, and so on. He figures out about the Gulf Stream. He does the experiments to do it, to be able to chart it. He is, of course, an exemplary inventor. Invents the lightning rod, bifocals, the glass harmonica, for which Mozart and Beethoven will compose pieces of music for that instrument. He develops the medical catheter because one of his brothers needs help, that would, it's kidney stones, I think, that would help with. He is the one that really, he's essential in making the postal system a truly national communications network. That's why the Second Continental Congress will name him the first Postmaster General. He founds a college that will later become the University of Pennsylvania, and so on. That's a little animadversion while we go through these dates, that we must think of Franklin as this huge, larger than life personality that people found attractive. He really does show us what the Enlightenment is at its best, right? That here's a man who's completely given over to projects of civic improvement, to finding out how the world works mechanically and inventing things that will make life better. And he captured the imagination of Americans and Europeans alike, and that's what puts us in mind of this question: what are the advantages and disadvantages of the ideal of being self-made? We used to talk about being a self-made man or self-made woman, right? Franklin was that. I mean, the American dream, that's what we've got with Ben Franklin. There are obvious upsides. We're looking through those right now. But there are perhaps costs too, and we want to balance those, right? The Enlightenment view of the human person is one that says, don't be melancholy, don't brood over these dark places. Get out into the world. That's what David Hume would say, right? With whom Franklin was friends. They were great friends. Franklin and Hume, Franklin and Adam Smith. Franklin knew Voltaire, right? He's right in the thick of this world, even though he comes from the Boston of Cotton Mather. He's one of these who shows us what it could get the world if you get into society. You do mutual aid with like-minded fellows, and you devote yourself to research and to conversation and to reading. But then, is there that confidence, that absolute confidence that Franklin always showed? Is there a danger in that? As we continue the chronology, we would just want to keep that in mind. It's something that he asks when he's asking this question in 1733, which leads into what we have as the Autobiography. He conceives a bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection, right? He starts to do the work of those 13 virtues that he has listed in the Autobiography and tries to work on these self-consciously. So part of his self-making isn't just modern, it's part of this classical tradition of, I need to work on virtues. That's how I become a better human being. 1733 is also when he starts publishing the Poor Richard's Almanac, which is what, I guess a lot of us when we were younger, this is how we first knew him. 1736, a son Francis dies of smallpox, and he also in that year organizes the Union Fire Company, the first fire company in Philadelphia. In 1739, he befriends George Whitefield, who's the great figure behind the Great Awakening. So again, this man, Franklin, he contained worlds, right? That's part of that Boston background. He's with a very religious person, and he's friends with him, even though he's also hobnobbing with philosophes. In 1741, he designs the Pennsylvania fireplace, colloquially known as the Franklin stove. That was not very successful either commercially or as an actual invention, but it was there mainly as an outgrowth of his concern with applying studies on heat and heat transfer and trying to make that something that would be useful for our lives. 1745, a Royal Society member, Royal Society of London member, sends a pamphlet on German experiments in electricity, along with a glass tube. He sends this to the library company, and Franklin at that point gets hooked on the experiments with electricity. He gives us a lot of terms that we end up using: conductor, positive and negative, battery, even electrician, though he was using the word differently. That's all from Franklin. And of course, it's his work in electricity that's going to be what secures his place, and it really is an unshakable place in the history of science. At the time, he was thought of as second to Newton. I mean, it's really quite amazing. So he continues these experiments. It's taking up all his time. Eventually, he hands over his side of the printing business to a partner. He retires in 1748. Because of his savvy investing and all of that, he's pulling in a huge annual income, and he's able to devote himself from then on to scientific experimentation and to civic activity. So he's already done so much while he was doing this work, his day job, as it were, but now he can just devote himself. He thinks of himself at this point as a gentleman. Eventually the English will insult him along those lines, and then he starts to try to find a different social self-identification. It's in 1752 probably that the kite experiment happens. It's important to understand what is going on here. It's not to get struck by lightning, even though that could have happened. It was a very dangerous experiment to run. What it proved, and why this is so celebrated, and necessarily so, he sends, well, it's actually his son Billy who's holding the kite, but he sends the kite into the direction of a storm cloud. And what happens is that a charge comes down. It's not a lightning strike. That would have been bad. A charge comes down, and it is able to be collected in a Leyden jar. What that proved is that lightning is a form of electricity. And this was huge. It showed that lightning isn't some thunderbolt from Zeus, something mythological, supernatural. It's a force that we know of, that they've been experimenting on. Again, it's like Newton, right? Newton is showing that everything works according to the law of gravity. Franklin has just shown, with this experiment that he came up with at least, that lightning is not some other thing. It is this thing that we've been experimenting on across borders, right? In Germany, in England, in France, in America, everybody's working on electricity. And of course, it obviously changes everything in the modern world, how we live. So he develops these experiments. He gives protocols for how to continue experimentation. He's the decisive figure in advancing electrical research. A lot of people are working on it, but he's the one who makes it into a self-augmenting process, as it were. So this is why he's so celebrated as a scientist, and justly so. These are called, as a group, his work, they're the Philadelphia experiments. That's what they're known as in the world. In 1757, he's sent to England to advance the anti-proprietary party of Pennsylvania. The Penn family had been given Pennsylvania as a way of settling some royal debts. They were given an absolute proprietorship, William Penn was, and that meant that they had full control. By this time, the Penn family, they were no longer Quaker, they were actually Anglicans, and they still had the prerogative to veto any legislation of the Pennsylvania Assembly and not be taxed on their land. So the Pennsylvania Assembly sent Franklin to try to renegotiate this setup because it was so unfavorable to Republican self-government. That didn't go well. This is one of the few times where Franklin didn't come out successful. It's actually, maybe it's these few years of not succeeding that may have given him the wisdom he needed to have such a long string later. He goes back again to advance the anti-proprietary party around the time of the Stamp Act in 1765. Eventually, after some missteps there, he successfully gets, while he's in England, he gets the Parliament to revoke the Stamp Act. It is that, at that point, the American people realize this man can get us what we need from England. So he's got this prominence. He comes back from that London mission in 1775, right after the beginning of, after the shots were fired not far from here at Lexington and Concord. He's immediately sent as a representative, as one of the delegates from Pennsylvania to the Second Continental Congress, and then his position is foremost amongst the founders at this point. He's on the drafting committee, the Committee of Five, that drafts the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson is the principal author of. You see this kind of nicely portrayed in the miniseries on John Adams. In 1759, the University of St. Andrews gives him the honorary doctorate that first allows him to be called Dr. Franklin. Oxford later gives him an honorary doctorate. This is a man who only had 2 years of formal schooling. It's kind of remarkable. He is ambassador to France from 1776 to 1785. It is, of course, Franklin who negotiates the alliance with France, without which America could not have won the Revolutionary War. You cannot overstate how important Franklin diplomacy was. And we can kind of leave it at that. He has this great length of life going to 1790. He has a role, of course, in the Constitutional Convention, and this is a life that is as consequential as any for the birth of America, but also for the formation of the American ethos, both as someone who inherited the American dream, as it were, and lived it out, but also as one who makes that dream seem possible, plausible, as a thing that even now, this ideal of becoming the self-made person, he's as good a representative as any, and he's going to be the quintessential American embodiment of it. So we ask ourselves not to judge his life as far as some of the things we might find irregular. Who doesn't have irregularities in his or her life? But just the question, if we took this ideal of self-making as our own again, would we be as productive? I mean, or something along this line, to create civic organizations that do real good, right? Essays to do good. These are real attempts, sallies into the public world to change things. He did it. He advanced research. He's so hungry for knowledge that he wants to relieve man's estate, right? This is all there. Okay, we want to be like that. Are there downsides? Is there a balance between this extroversion for good and maybe a desire and need to be inward sometimes and to deal with the mysteries of suffering and those who don't make it, right? So that's the question I would like us to think of as we read this selection from the autobiography that gives us the plan according to those virtues that he lays out. We need to think about which ones he doesn't highlight, and how important it is to do the ones that he does highlight. How might our lives be different if we take Benjamin Franklin seriously?